Welcome to the Ducks Unlimited podcast, the only podcast about all things waterfowl. From hunting insights to science-based discussions about ducks, geese, and issues affecting waterfowl and wetlands conservation in North America, we bring the resource to you. The DU Podcast with your host, Chris Jennings.
Today I've got a return guest, John Pullman, a freelance contributor to Ducks Unlimited magazine and ducks.org. John, welcome back to the show.
Hey, thanks, Chris. Always happy to join you.
You know, John and I have been talking offline a little bit and, just discussing some different tactics pieces. And John recently did a feature for Ducks Unlimited magazine on the 5 simple spreads for waterfowl. We get into the complexities of decoy spreads and, paying attention to certain things, but sometimes, just being, the most basic spreads, sometimes are the most efficient and the most effective for hunters to look at. So I just wanted to have John join me today, and we were just going to kind of run through and just talk about some of these, really simple spreads. And John, when you started out, when you began writing this feature, how did you approach this as like, all right, I'm going to go with, not necessarily basic, but just like a simple decoy spread? How did you approach that?
Sure. Well, like you mentioned before, the idea that bigger is better is something that it's easy to get wrapped into as a duck hunter and as a goose hunter. And let's face it, a giant spread of, a big floater spread or big field spread is fun to look at. It's sure fun to hunt out of. But it takes a lot of work and a lot of time. And sometimes, like you said, too, it's just not the most effective. And so what I did is I tried to look at 5 different scenarios where a smaller spread is actually going to be more effective for you. It's obviously going to be a little bit easier to set up. It's not going to take so many people to do the work. But like I say, most importantly, it's going to be the most effective way to put birds on the strap. And so I tried to pick 5 kind of different areas that would kind of cover the gamut that waterfowl hunters encounter throughout the year. And started with kind of a small puddler setup from a good friend out in New York, Mike Bard.
When I look at the spread and the diagrams are on ducks.org, you can check them out. This is something that can work anywhere across the country. It's not, sometimes we do some different decoy diagrams that are very region specific, but this one really, you can do this anywhere from, California to Washington to South Carolina. This spread would be, beneficial to implement for any hunter out there. And what were some of the main takeaways from Mike when he started explaining how he approached putting the spread together?
Yeah, absolutely. So Mike hunts up in upstate New York, and the spread that he shared with me is one that he uses in the early season. And like you say, this is something that it would work, and it does work out here out on the prairies in South Dakota. Really, anywhere an early season scenario where you have kind of a mixed bag of ducks that you're targeting, and that's kind of the real highlight of his spread was that he likes to use decoys that the species specific that he is seeing in the area at that time. He doesn't use a lot of them, but he uses them kind of characteristically too, that wood ducks he sees are going to be off on their own, black ducks that he sees are normally going to be off on their own type of things. And so he uses that mix of decoys, small numbers, kind of mimic what he's seeing on the marsh at that time. And the big thing for him is that he, when you're talking early season hunting, and it's true here in South Dakota, and I think it's true in a lot of places, particularly in the northern part of North America, where ducks maybe aren't necessarily as receptive to calling. And so location is a big, big thing. And then visibility is a big thing. And so Mike, makes a point of noting that, he's got these decoys kind of separated in these little pockets as he sees them on the marsh. But then visibility, whether it's a motion decoy or a jerk string, that's the real big key. And then placing that motion decoy in a way where the sun is going to catch those wings as they flash. And that's that visibility, that spark of motion is really what draws attention to this small decoy spread.
Yeah. And I think another thing to point out here that I really took away from it is the separation of species. We talk about that even at where I hunt with some of the guys that I hunt with. The importance of separating those species sometimes is crucial. At other times it's not. But, when you're putting together one of these very specific spreads, having your wood ducks in one corner, having your black ducks separated from your widgeon and your pintails, it can make a difference. And I think that's definitely one takeaway that I took from this spread.
And I think it goes back to just the realism, the mimicking what you're seeing on the marsh at that time. And for Mike in the early season and for other hunters in early season, you've got, different species that are maybe using a particular corner of a marsh at one time. Mimic what you see and keep it as realistic as possible and give the ducks one less reason to not come into decoys.
Yeah, that's always a good idea. The next one on the list is green timber greenheads. And this is, to be honest, this is one thing that I struggle with, growing up in the Midwest and then moving down here in the South. I do hunt some green timber, but I'd never really, had a well thought out decoy spread for the timber until the last couple of years, where I've really started putting some emphasis on really trying to separate myself and my decoys from other people. But you talk to Tony Vandemore up there in Missouri, and they hunt some bottomlands and different types of flooded timber habitats. And what did Tony explain how he approaches his timber spread?
Absolutely. If anybody that knows, if you've watched videos of Tony or if you've been able to hunt up at his place at Habitat Flats, that the guy's not afraid to put out decoys. When it calls for it, he is not afraid to use a big bunch just for visibility and for getting attention, for trafficking birds. But when it comes to his hunting these little flooded timber spots that they have, he really minimizes the number of decoys he has and really separates them into two groups. And the bigger bunch of decoys he places on the upwind side of the hole and kind of tied up against the timber a little bit, and then only places maybe a handful, 5, 6, 7 decoys on the downwind side. And the idea, and this is all based on, what Tony has experienced and his watching how ducks work the timber holes that he's hunting, is that these birds, when they filter down through the timber, that they kind of bounce between these two little pockets of decoys before settling down and obviously giving the hunters a chance to make a shot. And what he thinks and what his experiences showed him is that it keeps those ducks from filtering off into the trees before you get a chance to get a shot at them. So kind of like I say, he has these two little pockets, one on the upwind side, the bigger number, and then on the downwind side up against the trees, a smaller number of decoys. And like I say, those birds filter in and they kind of bounce back and forth. And as they're bouncing back and forth, that's when you call the shot.
Yeah. And one thing, that is not really, added into this diagram. And I know just from experience from being up there to hunt in some of his little timber holes that he has, he's not afraid to put some Canada goose decoys in there either. And that's not because they're shooting a bunch of Canadas. It's because those large decoys, they have that wide on the bottom, that they really, really show up from the air. And he's running a lot of traffic and mainly mallards, really. But those Canada goose decoys can really stick out, and it gives his little spread, a little bit of a different look from anything else that these ducks are seeing. And I think that's certainly one thing for people to keep in mind. Yeah,
that's one tip that if I've taken from talking to Tony over the last, 10, 12 years that I've been doing this, that he is big on visibility. And especially when you're trafficking birds, and whether it's in a timber hole or one of his little, water holes or a flooded corner, whatever it is, it's getting visibility, giving those ducks a reason to come take a look. And then that's when the calling and the motion and the jerk string, all that stuff comes into play. But it is when you're trying to traffic birds and they are going from point A to point B, and you're trying to get them to stop someplace in between, you have to get their attention somehow. And that's where he'll use, Canada goose decoys predominantly in a lot of his spreads, just because of their visibility factor.
Yeah, I've talked to a lot of guys who do that, and that is a little helpful trick for people, even though you may not be targeting Canadas.
Yeah.
It's not a bad idea to throw a few out there, just as as really add to that visibility and that realism. Number 3 is really from your neck of the woods, and as far as the prairie pothole, and a lot of our listeners, do travel up there early in the season. They're traveling to the prairies and getting in some of these little prairie hunts, but some of them may not really understand how the bird behavior up there is so much different than even what it is down here, especially this time of year. How did, you used Bill Wilroth, which is owner of Dakota Decoy Company. How did he explain his approach to hunting a small prairie pothole?
Yeah, exactly. And again, like so many of these examples, this is based on his experience. These are guys that have hunted across North America, and they've kind of seen it all. And this was the first one. And when I asked him about if he had a kind of a small decoy setup or a place where he's used a small spread to be effective, he there was no hesitation. He knew the exact hunt to think of. And they were hunting in North Dakota a few years ago and came across this small, probably like a quarter-acre size pothole, 30 yards wide across type of a deal. And it was just wall-to-wall mallards. And so next morning they're thinking, game on, this is going to be it. It's one of these little potholes that they hop into in the morning before they hit the green field type of a deal. And so they covered that thing with decoys, and they had multiple spinners out there. And, there was no way those ducks were gonna avoid this decoy spread. Well, first flock comes in and they were hanky. There was something they didn't like. Second flock did the same thing. And it's one of those things where you either got to make a change or, you're going to be staring at ducks flaring off of something the rest of the morning. So they started pulling decoys, pulled motion decoys, pulled everything. And they kept a small couple of dozen decoys tight up against those cattails, and maybe had one or two motion decoys out just away from the blind to kind of take attention away from the blind a little bit. And that was the trick. And it was just night and day. The next flocks that came in, there was no hesitation. It was feet down, back flats over the decoys, and they had a stellar hunt. But it was that realization that filling that really small little pothole with decoys was just not the way, was just not the ticket that day. And that's a situation we come across, for folks that come up here and freelance on the prairies, some of your best hunts are going to be on these little small pockets of water, and so it's something to keep in mind that more is not necessarily better, that if you're going to err on the side of something right away, maybe err on the side of keeping it small, keeping it tight up against the cattails, keeping those decoys up close to you, using a little bit of motion to get their attention, and then watch the birds and watch their reaction.
Yeah, and I think one thing that he points out here with these small spreads, when you've got your decoys tied up to the cattails like that, maybe a couple out there for visibility, I think the one thing that people have to remember is some of these little bodies of water you can shoot across.
Yeah.
Even if these ducks land short of the decoys, they're still within 35, 40 yards. I mean, some of these very small pockets of water can hold large numbers of ducks, and not necessarily filling the hole with decoys is a good idea because, and another thing you've got when you provide more decoys in the hole, you've got more reasons for the ducks to find a problem with it.
Mm-hmm.
And that's something that people should probably think about.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And just kind of going back to your point about small water holes, some of my best hunts in South Dakota have been on these tiny little pockets of water, and where, I've used as few as maybe 3 or 4 decoys in a spinner, a motion decoy, just because I know that's where they want to be. And I don't want to cover up the water. I want to give them spots to land, things like that. And absolutely, you could, like you see, you could throw a rock across them. They're so small, or even smaller than that, And so, yeah, if in a small spot like that, choke things down a little bit. Don't use quite so much. Use some motion, and then, like I say, watch with the birds how they react.
Yeah, I had a place in Indiana like that when I was growing up that was just a small little slough. And we first started out, we're trying to drag decoys into this spot. And what we realized was, like you said, 2 or 3 decoys.
Yeah.
The ducks want to be there anyway.
Yep.
They're trying to get away from, they're trying to get away from the crowds, and they're trying to get away from anything that could potentially harm them. And so we were throwing 2 or 3 decoys, and we probably didn't even need that. 1 decoy in the middle probably would have done it. But
yeah.
I have a passion for throwing decoys. So, throwing these tiny spreads is like, it takes a lot for me to try and convince myself that that's going to work. I like decoy spreads, and I like throwing decoys.
Exactly. It's counterintuitive in some ways, because it's what we've grown up doing and grown up using, these big decoy spreads, or thinking that more is better, but it's easy to overthink it sometimes. Keep it simple. And usually that's the best way.
All right. The next one's a Backwater Mallards, and the gentleman that you used for this, is from California, yet, looking at the diagram and looking at how the spread is set up, it's very similar to what we were just kind of discussing, but this spread is beneficial for anyone across the country. It's very easily could be, replicated, and really looks like something that hunters all over the country could use. And it's called like a Backwater Mallards. Kind of explain where this idea came from.
Sure. And talking to Scott, he hunts out in Sacramento Valley, and he, as you can imagine, there's a lot of hunting pressure out there. And his spread is as much a reaction to, or in response, I should say, to that hunting pressure as it is to anything, and that he's trying to do something different. In the scenario that he hunts quite often, there's a main river channel, and he's targeting these ducks on these small little chutes of water that run off of that main river channel. And, these ducks in this area, they get used to seeing the same thing day after day after day. And that's, how that is something that we run into across, every hunter can identify with, where ducks get used to seeing the same spread morning after morning. And, Scott's reaction to that, or his response to that, is, again, just bringing everything small, using only maybe 3 or 4 decoys in this hole, perhaps maybe even only using a jerk string. Only those decoys in the hole, just to make it look different from what these birds have been seeing, day after day. And so, like I say, any situation where you've got maybe a main river channel or a main travel corridor where these birds are working, and then some sort of little side shoot or an offshoot from that river or whatever, using some motion on a jerk string or a small number of decoys to do something different, and it's been really effective for Scott over the years.
Yeah, and this really looks like, me just kind of rolling through my head here. It looks like a great spread to use, where you've got 3, 4 decoys just on a jerk string, and those are the only decoys you're using. It kind of looks like something that someone could implement on a day that doesn't have much wind. I'm facing a lot of that this year in Arkansas, where the days I've been able to hunt, I just haven't had the conditions. We have the ducks, but it's something that if you throw out a big spread and there's no wind and there's not much motion out there, you just don't provide that realistic look. And keeping every single decoy that you throw out, which may only be 4, keeping those moving, really, I think adds to Scott's spread here. And I think, that gives that different look that, the hunting, like you said, the hunting pressure there in Sacramento Valley is pretty heavy. And, giving a totally realistic view is, I think, just critical and something that, hunters may look at doing.
Absolutely. Yeah. I'm not sure if there's anything more depressing than setting up on a morning and having no wind, and you've got 4, 5, 6 dozen decoys out there that are just sitting there lifeless. And I think you're exactly right. This is a chance to add some motion. And with that small number of decoys there, there's no way to make 4 or 5 dozen decoys move when there's no wind, but you can do it with a jerk string with a handful of decoys. And like I say, it's something that really works for Scott.
Number 5 on the list here is a cold combo for late season geese. And you reached out to Ben Cade in Minnesota. You've used him as a resource many times before. I'm very familiar with some of the things that he does, but this spread looks like, something that could be implemented on any, kind of small creek, river, anything that, as that temperature changes and these bodies of water start to lock up, yet there's an open hole. It looks like he's really set up for those types of conditions. Do you want to explain kind of what Ben does that really sets his spread apart?
Sure. And this is a tactic that I hear a lot of goose hunters talk about when you're late season, the temperatures are cold, there's snow on the ground, there's ice, and that's to use sleeper shells. Sleeper shell decoys that when you watch these big birds come in when it's cold out, whether they're in the field or they're landing on a icy shoreline or whatever it may be, they hit the ground and they land and then they hit the ground and they tuck those feet underneath, and they it looks exactly like a sleeper shell. And I think that's the key to Ben's spread here, is that he doesn't use a ton of decoys, but the majority of the ones that he does use are sleeper shells up on the ice to give it that realistic look, because that's what these big birds are doing this time of the year. And I can say that if listeners out there, if you've never had the chance to hunt Canada geese late season over water, it's fantastic. It's probably my favorite way to hunt Canada geese, because it seems like they are just more receptive in that situation to calling, more receptive to the flagging, more receptive to the decoy spread. And more often than not, you've got those birds at your, in the hole. It's just a great way to hunt those birds. But like I say, his big thing is stacking that, whether it's a sandbar or an ice shelf out in the river or whatever it is, stacking that with some sleeper shells, and then adding some floaters out in the water to kind of position those birds for landing, to create a pocket for those birds as they're approaching. But the majority of his decoys are up on the ground, sleeper shells down, make it look realistic, and it's a great way to hunt Canada geese.
This spread's set up, really it's, a small water tactic as well. I mean, some of these little backwater sloughs and creeks and rivers, they offer hunters the opportunity to set up in a place where once these birds commit, they're in there. And this is, like you said, it's fantastic hunting these, big birds over water like this. And it really provides some of the most, engaging shots, I should say. I mean, sometimes you get these big birds at 8-10 yards, and that's, they feel like they're getting ready to land in your lap. It's a really, really exciting way to do it. And I think one thing you stressed here with Ben's spread is he does add a couple full bodies in the mix. You look at a flock of geese that are resting on a sandbar or ice shelf or whatever, not all of them are asleep. They're smart enough to know that, a few of them have to keep a lookout. And he does add in a couple full bodies there, just to provide that another layer of realism. I think it's a pretty cool spread.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I'm just kind of thinking out loud here, and you've kind of hinted at this already, that these spreads are primarily, small water spreads are designed or small decoy spreads are designed kind of for small spaces. And, as hunters look at opportunities throughout the year, don't ignore these small little areas, these small pockets of water, small marshes, or whatever it is, just like what you said. Because when those birds do it, they don't have much of a choice but to be right there in your face in shooting range. And it's like I said, it's probably one of my favorite ways to hunt are these little small spots that the birds don't have a chance to land short. They don't have a chance to land on the other side of the lake or the other side of the bigger slough. When they're there, they are there, and it just seems like your hunting success goes up, and it's just a lot of fun to be able to see those birds up close.
Yeah, and everyone wants to see these big flocks of 200 and 300 birds, come feet down in. But the reality is, with some of these small spaces, you may not have. It may not be a volume game. You may only have 2 or 3 flocks come in. But on the flip side of that, your opportunities to actually knock those birds down and decoy them in close, increases dramatically there.
I'll take 12 mallards at 15 yards versus 75 at 60. So
that's exactly right. Yeah. We can watch birds all day long, but if we're trying to put them in close and get, really, really clean shots, some of these spreads are definitely something that people should look at. And another thing, just to add on to this, if you go through this article and you're kind of looking at it, every single one of these pieces has a motion element. And that's something I know we've talked about before, but, how are you kind of explaining to people like, all right, you can do this and do that, but you're going to want to add some type of motion into these small little potholes?
Absolutely. Well, and again, it goes back to, if you're hunting a small little opening in a cattail marsh or a small bend in the river, down below the trees or whatever it may be, you've got to have something to get their attention, and especially if you're working traffic or something like that, where these birds are, you're trying to get them to stop in between points A and B. It is really important to have something there to get their attention, whether it's the use of Canada goose decoys or whatever, but motion is the best way. And, when you're talking geese, flagging is probably the most effective thing that I have seen. When it's ducks, motion decoys are great, but in all honesty, everyone that I talk to, every veteran duck hunter that I've talked to always says if they have to bring one thing to the blind, and they have to leave everything else at home, but they want to make sure that they put ducks on the strap, it's a jerk string. And it's as old as time, it's been around a long time, but it's been around because it's really effective. And again, it goes back to adding that motion on the water when the weather is calm or whatever it may be, adding that motion on the water, get their decoys, make it look realistic. And you can probably kill ducks and geese over these small spreads without motion. fishing. But if you want to do it successfully and consistently, you have to add that element, and you have to have that element in there to be to put birds in the pocket.
Well, man, John, that's been great. I think this provides, our listeners and anybody out there a pretty good idea of what to look for, some changes, maybe some smaller spreads, look at mixing things up, adding motion. I mean, I think all of these are good topics that we could probably dive deeper into. But, if anyone wants to check that out, it's 5 simple decoy spreads, and it covers ducks, geese. You can check that out on ducks.org. Or you can check it out in the past issue of the magazine as well. But John, thanks for joining me. I really, really appreciate you doing this.
Absolutely. Thanks, Chris. I appreciate it.
I'd like to thank my guest, John Pullman, for coming on and talking decoy spreads with me. I'd like to thank Clay Baird, our producer, for doing a great job. And I'd like to thank you, the listener, for joining us on the DU podcast and supporting wetlands conservation.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the DU Podcast. Be sure to rate, review, and subscribe to the show, and visit www.ducks.org/DU Podcast for resources based on today's topics, as well as access to more episodes. Opinions expressed by guests do not necessarily reflect those of Ducks Unlimited. Until next time, stay tuned to the ducks.